You were taught that debt is weakness, that countries that borrow too much eventually collapse, that markets punish irresponsibility. But what if the most indebted country in history is also the most powerful? What if its debt is not a burden, but a weapon? While governments cut budgets, households struggle, and entire economies tighten their belts, one country borrows more, spends more, and grows stronger. Not because it is disciplined, but because the system is built around it. This is not a story about mismanagement. It is a story about design. And once you see how the system works, you cannot unsee who pays for it. The world is taught to fear debt. Nations are warned that deficits lead to collapse, that borrowing weakens sovereignty, that markets eventually punish irresponsibility. This logic applies almost everywhere, except to one country. The United States of America has constructed a financial reality in which debt is not a vulnerability, but a strategic asset, a mechanism of influence, and a pillar of global control. Understanding this paradox is the first step to understanding the modern economic order. At the center of this system stands the American state debt, the largest in human history. Measured in nominal terms, it has expanded beyond any historical precedent, surpassing levels that would trigger immediate crises in other economies. Yet markets do not flee. Interest rates remain comparatively stable. Demand for American government bonds persists, and during every global shock, capital flows not away from the United States, but toward it. This is not an accident of confidence. It is the result of structural design. The foundation of this design is the dollar's role as the primary global reserve currency. Oil, industrial metals, food commodities, shipping insurance, sovereign reserves, and cross-border settlements are overwhelmingly denominated in dollars. This creates permanent external demand for American currency and American debt. When the United States issues bonds, it is not simply borrowing. It is supplying the world with the financial instruments required to keep global trade functioning. Debt becomes infrastructure. This reverses the traditional power dynamic between debtor and creditor. In normal circumstances, the borrower must earn, save, or export value to repay obligations. The United States, however, borrows in its own currency, a currency it alone controls. When pressure rises, it does not need to default. It can refinance. It can extend maturities. It can allow inflation to erode the real value of liabilities. The burden of adjustment is silently exported to every economy that holds dollars or dollar-denominated assets. Global crises make this mechanism even clearer. During financial panics, wars, pandemics, or energy shocks, investors instinctively seek safety. That safety is defined not by balanced budgets or low debt ratios, but by liquidity and trust. United States government bonds are treated as the deepest and most liquid market on earth. When fear spreads, demand for American debt rises. The more unstable the world becomes, the easier it is for the United States to finance itself. This creates a self-reinforcing loop. Instability increases demand for dollars. Demand for dollars strengthens the dollar. A stronger dollar attracts more capital into American financial markets. This capital finances further deficits. The cycle repeats, converting global volatility into domestic advantage. What would destroy another economy becomes fuel for this one. Critics often ask why inflation does not immediately break this system. The answer lies in scale and distribution. Inflation generated inside the United States does not remain confined within its borders. Because the dollar is embedded in global pricing, inflation is transmitted outward through higher commodity prices, higher shipping costs, and tighter financial conditions in dollar-dependent economies. Other countries are forced to raise interest rates, cut spending, or devalue their currencies to defend stability. The United States absorbs less pain relative to its position because the system prioritizes its currency. This asymmetry explains why warnings about unsustainable debt have failed to materialize into collapse for decades. Traditional metrics lose meaning when the debtor controls the unit of account. Debt-to-output ratios, deficit projections, and long-term fiscal gaps matter only if markets can impose discipline. In this case, discipline is structurally impossible without dismantling the system itself. Institutions built after the Second World War reinforced this architecture. Bretton Woods did not merely establish financial cooperation, it anchored global trade to the American monetary system. Even after the abandonment of the gold standard, the dollar's dominance persisted because alternatives lacked scale, trust, and military backing. The United States does not just issue currency, it guarantees the system that makes that currency indispensable. This leads to a final uncomfortable truth. The American debt is not a bill waiting to be paid. It is a mechanism through which global savings are absorbed, global risks are redistributed, and global growth is regulated. Countries do not finance the United States out of generosity. They do so because exiting the system would destabilize their own economies faster than it would harm America. The illusion, then, is not that the United States has too much debt. The illusion is that debt means the same thing for all countries. In this system, debt is power, deficits are leverage, and imbalance is the price of control. Until the dollar loses its central role, the rules will not change, and the world will continue financing the very structure that keeps it dependent, believing it has no alternative, because for now, it does not. The second layer of the debt illusion begins where common logic completely fails. In classical finance, the creditor holds power. The lender dictates terms, demands discipline, and can withdraw funding to force change. Yet, in the modern global system, the largest creditors of the United States of America possess astonishingly little leverage. This contradiction is not accidental. It is structural. At the core of this paradox stand China and Japan, the two largest foreign holders of American government debt. On paper, their position appears dominant. Trillions of dollars in Treasury securities sit on their balance sheets. Conventional wisdom suggests that such exposure should grant influence, bargaining power, and the ability to apply pressure. In reality, the opposite is true. Their size traps them. The reason is simple but brutal. American government bonds are not merely investments. They are reserves, collateral, liquidity buffers, and insurance mechanisms for entire financial systems. Central banks do not hold treasuries to earn yield. They hold them because nothing else can replace their function at scale. Selling them aggressively would not punish the United States. It would destabilize the seller. If China attempted a rapid reduction of its treasury holdings, bond prices would fall and yields would rise. That sounds threatening until the second-order effects appear. Falling prices would immediately reduce the value of China's remaining reserves. Rising yields would strengthen the dollar, making Chinese exports less competitive. Capital would flow into American markets seeking higher returns, reinforcing the very system China sought to weaken. The act of weaponizing debt would backfire. Japan faces an even tighter constraint. Its financial system is deeply intertwined with low-yield global liquidity. Japanese institutions rely on American debt markets to recycle surplus capital generated by decades of trade imbalances. Without treasuries, domestic alternatives would compress yields to levels that destabilize pensions, insurers, and banks. The cost of exit exceeds the cost of submission. This is why the phrase, America's creditors, is misleading. These countries are not lenders in the traditional sense. They are participants in a closed loop where surplus production must be parked somewhere safe. The United States provides that parking space. The price is dependency. Historical episodes reveal this dynamic with clarity. During moments of political tension, threats to reduce Treasury purchases surface regularly. Each time, markets react briefly, then normalize. No sustained liquidation ever follows. The reason is not diplomacy, it is arithmetic. There is no alternative asset class large enough, liquid enough, and trusted enough to absorb reserves of this magnitude. Attempts to diversify away from the dollar encounter the same wall. European bonds lack unified fiscal backing. Emerging market debt lacks stability. Gold lacks yield and flexibility. Digital assets lack regulatory certainty. Every alternative fails one of the core requirements of a global reserve instrument. The system forces concentration. This dependency reshapes global power relationships. Countries that appear strong through export dominance find themselves financially constrained. Their growth models generate surpluses that must be recycled into the very system that limits their autonomy. Trade success deepens financial subordination. The asymmetry becomes sharper during crises. When global stress rises, foreign creditors do not reduce exposure to American debt. They increase it. Capital flight from risk pushes reserves into treasuries. Yield becomes irrelevant. Survival dominates strategy. The United States absorbs global fear and converts it into funding. This mechanism explains why American fiscal expansion during crises encounters little resistance. Trillions in new issuance are absorbed not because of optimism, but because the system has nowhere else to go. Liquidity overrides ideology. Debt becomes the safest option in an unsafe world. Political narratives often frame this relationship as mutual dependence, but the symmetry is false. The United States depends on demand for its debt. Creditors depend on the existence of that debt. One side can expand supply indefinitely. The other cannot exit without self-harm. The result is a form of financial captivity. Creditors are locked into preserving the value of the system they privately criticize. Stability in American debt markets becomes a national interest for countries that supposedly oppose American dominance. Their reserves, currencies, and banking systems demand it. This is why calls for de-dollarization advance slowly and cautiously. Reducing exposure too quickly risks destabilizing domestic financial architecture. Moving too slowly preserves dependence. The window for escape narrows with every year of accumulated reserves. By the time a country realizes the trap, its balance sheet ensures compliance. The larger the holdings, the weaker the leverage. Power in this system does not belong to the creditor. It belongs to the issuer of the currency that everyone else must hold. And so the illusion persists. The world believes it finances America. In reality, it finances its own confinement. The trap tightens further when the mechanics of reserve management are examined in detail. For major exporting nations, holding American government debt is not a discretionary choice driven by political preference. It is the mechanical consequence of persistent trade surpluses. When goods are sold into the American market, payment arrives in dollars. Those dollars must be sterilized, reinvested, or recycled to prevent domestic currency appreciation and financial instability. The simplest and safest recycling channel leads straight back into United States Treasury securities. This is where the illusion of leverage collapses completely. A country that runs large surpluses against the United States of America accumulates dollars by design. Refusing to reinvest those dollars would require allowing its own currency to rise sharply, destroying export competitiveness, compressing margins, and triggering unemployment at home. The creditor's apparent power dissolves into a domestic political constraint. Debt ownership becomes an obligation, not a weapon. This dynamic explains why even during periods of heightened geopolitical hostility, reserve behavior remains remarkably stable. Public rhetoric may harden, sanctions may escalate, and diplomatic channels may freeze. Yet balance sheets continue to reflect quiet compliance. Central banks prioritize liquidity, not ideology. Finance follows structure, not speeches. The bond market reinforces this discipline through scale. The American Treasury market is not simply large, it is functionally irreplaceable. Its depth allows continuous issuance without liquidity collapse. Its maturity spectrum allows precise duration management. Its integration with derivatives markets allows hedging at a scale no other sovereign market can match. A reserve manager seeking safety does not compare treasuries to alternatives in theory. They compare them in execution. Nothing else works. Consider the implications of a hypothetical coordinated sell-off. Even if several major holders attempted simultaneous liquidation, the immediate consequence would be market volatility, not systemic collapse. Domestic institutions within the United States, including pension funds, insurers, and asset managers, would absorb supply at higher yields. The Federal Reserve could stabilize markets through balance sheet expansion. Yield increases would attract global capital seeking return. The feedback loop would restore equilibrium. Meanwhile, the sellers would face collapsing reserve values, currency pressure, and capital outflows. Their financial systems would absorb the shock long before the American system did. The threat is symmetrical only on paper. In practice, it is asymmetric by design. This asymmetry extends beyond bonds into trade settlement, payment infrastructure, and credit pricing. Dollar-denominated liabilities dominate global corporate finance. Banks outside the United States fund themselves in dollars to access global markets. A disruption in dollar liquidity transmits stress immediately across borders. During every major crisis of the modern era, from financial collapses to pandemics, the demand for dollar liquidity surged. Swap lines with the Federal Reserve became lifelines. Access to the system became survival. This reality transforms the role of creditors into that of system stabilizers. Countries holding large volumes of American debt have a vested interest in maintaining its value and liquidity. Their financial security depends on the uninterrupted functioning of the market they ostensibly finance. Selling becomes sabotage of self-interest. The narrative of creditor pressure also ignores the role of internal American demand. Domestic consumption absorbs global output on a scale unmatched by any other market. Export-driven economies rely on access to American consumers to sustain growth. Financial exposure reinforces trade dependence. Attempts to decouple financially risk trade retaliation and market loss. The system links capital flows and consumption into a single dependency chain. Over time, this structure reshapes strategic behavior. Countries optimize not for independence, but for survivability within the system. Reserve diversification becomes symbolic rather than transformative. Incremental shifts are tolerated. Structural exits are postponed indefinitely. Each year of delay increases exposure and reduces optionality. The paradox deepens as debt grows. Larger American deficits create more reserve assets for the world to hold. More reserves increase dependence. Dependence increases compliance. What appears as fiscal irresponsibility functions as global monetary expansion under American control. The final irony is psychological. The presence of large foreign creditors is often cited as evidence of American vulnerability. In reality, it is proof of systemic dominance. Creditors fear disruption more than debtors. The issuer sets the rules, the holders adjust. This is not a temporary imbalance awaiting correction. It is a stable equilibrium enforced by incentives, constraints, and institutional inertia. Until an alternative system emerges that can absorb global surpluses at comparable scale and reliability, the relationship will persist. The creditor without power is not a contradiction. It is the defining feature of the modern financial order. Power in the modern world no longer requires occupation or invasion. It requires architecture. The most effective weapon of the contemporary economic order is invisible, legal, and embedded so deeply into global finance that it appears neutral. This weapon is not force, but access. Access to liquidity, access to markets, access to settlement, access to survival during crisis. At the center of this architecture stands United States of America, not as a conventional empire, but as the issuer, gatekeeper, and ultimate arbiter of the financial system every major economy depends on. The primary instrument of this power is the dollar, not merely as a currency, but as the base layer of global pricing. Energy contracts, food supply chains, freight insurance, sovereign borrowing, corporate debt, derivatives, and interbank funding are overwhelmingly denominated in dollars. This creates a condition where participation in global commerce requires exposure to American monetary conditions. Monetary policy decisions made in Washington transmit instantly into balance sheets in Asia, Europe, Africa, and Latin America. This transmission is not theoretical. When interest rates rise in the United States, capital flows reverse across the globe. Emerging markets experience currency depreciation, rising debt service costs, and capital flight. Governments are forced to cut spending, raise taxes, or seek external assistance. The policy choice of one country becomes a constraint imposed on dozens of others. The weapon is not intent, it is gravity. Financial sanctions amplify this power dramatically. Unlike traditional trade restrictions, modern sanctions target payment systems, clearing mechanisms, correspondent banking relationships, and access to reserve assets. A sanctioned entity does not merely lose the ability to trade with the United States. It loses the ability to settle transactions globally. Banks refuse exposure. Insurers withdraw coverage. Shipping contracts dissolve. Commerce becomes impossible, not because it is illegal everywhere, but because it is uninsurable and unfinanceable. The effectiveness of this mechanism rests on infrastructure dominance. Global payments rely on networks aligned with American regulatory reach. Dollar clearing flows through institutions subject to American jurisdiction. Even transactions between non-American entities can fall under American authority if settled in dollars. This extraterritorial reach transforms financial compliance into geopolitical obedience. The threat of exclusion often proves more powerful than its execution. Markets preemptively price risk. Corporations exit jurisdictions not yet sanctioned. Banks reduce exposure before regulations are formalized. Fear of losing access to dollar liquidity enforces discipline without direct enforcement. The system polices itself. Multilateral institutions reinforce this structure under the banner of stability. Organizations such as International Monetary Fund and World Bank present themselves as neutral providers of assistance. In practice, their frameworks align closely with the existing order. Emergency funding arrives with conditions that reshape fiscal policy, monetary independence, and regulatory regimes. Structural reforms are demanded in exchange for liquidity. Sovereignty becomes negotiable during crisis. These conditions are not arbitrary. They ensure compatibility with global capital flows dominated by the dollar system. Budget discipline, privatization, market liberalization, and central bank independence facilitate integration into global finance, but also limit domestic policy flexibility. Once integrated, exit becomes costly. Compliance becomes rational. The central stabilizer of this entire mechanism is the Federal Reserve. In moments of global stress, the Federal Reserve does not act solely as a domestic institution. It becomes the de facto central bank of the world. Dollar swap lines extended to select foreign central banks provide emergency liquidity that prevents systemic collapse. Access to these lines is not universal, it is selective. Inclusion signals trust. Exclusion signals vulnerability. During major crises, this role becomes unmistakable. Dollar shortages emerge as global demand for safety spikes. Foreign banks scramble for funding. The Federal Reserve expands its balance sheet and opens liquidity channels. Stability returns. The lesson is internalized by markets and governments alike. Survival requires alignment with the dollar system. This creates a hierarchy of privilege. Core allies receive liquidity support. Peripheral economies face harsher adjustment. The rules are consistent but unevenly applied. Power expresses itself not through coercion, but through prioritization. The weaponization of finance does not require constant activation. Its strength lies in credibility. Everyone understands the consequences of exclusion. As a result, behavior adapts preemptively. Governments adjust policy to avoid triggering instability. Corporations structure transactions to remain compliant. Banks design systems around dollar access. The architecture disciplines without visible force. What makes this system uniquely resilient is its legitimacy. It presents itself as technical, rules-based, and market-driven. Decisions appear procedural rather than political, yet the outcomes consistently reinforce existing power structures. Control hides behind complexity. This is why challenges to the system proceed cautiously. Alternative payment systems emerge slowly. Reserve diversification advances incrementally. Direct confrontation risks financial isolation. The cost of rebellion is immediate, the benefit uncertain. The financial weapon is not aimed, it is embedded. And as long as the world requires liquidity, stability, and settlement at scale, it remains loaded. The battlefield is invisible. The casualties are economic autonomy, and the war rarely announces itself. The deeper layer of financial weaponization emerges not in moments of headline sanctions, but in the routine operation of markets that appear neutral, technical, and apolitical. The most powerful form of control is exercised through pricing, ratings, and risk perception. These mechanisms determine who can borrow, at what cost, and under which conditions. They operate continuously, silently shaping outcomes long before crises become visible. Sovereign credit ratings are a critical lever in this system. A downgrade does not merely signal risk. It mechanically raises borrowing costs, restricts access to capital, and triggers regulatory consequences for institutional investors. Pension funds, insurers, and banks are often prohibited from holding assets below certain rating thresholds. When a country's rating falls, capital is forced out automatically. This process does not require political declarations. It enforces discipline through rules embedded in portfolio mandates. The structure of rating agencies amplifies this influence. Methodologies emphasize fiscal discipline, inflation control, institutional stability, and policy predictability as defined by global capital norms. Deviation from these expectations, even in pursuit of domestic priorities, is penalized. Governments learn quickly that policy independence carries a price. Conformity becomes financially rational. Bond markets reinforce this pressure through yield differentials. Investors demand compensation for perceived instability. Small changes in sentiment can cascade into funding crises. Because so much global debt is denominated in dollars, rising yields in the United States immediately transmit stress abroad. Debt service costs rise, not because domestic conditions deteriorate, but because the global benchmark shifts. Monetary tightening in one country becomes austerity elsewhere. This transmission mechanism is especially brutal for economies with large external dollar liabilities. Corporations and governments that borrow cheaply during periods of low global rates find themselves trapped when conditions reverse. Refinancing becomes expensive or impossible. Capital outflows accelerate. Currencies weaken. Inflation rises. The cycle feeds on itself. The trigger was external. The adjustment is domestic. Access to global capital markets thus becomes conditional on behavior. Countries that align with the prevailing financial order are rewarded with stability and liquidity. Those that diverge face volatility and isolation. This conditionality is rarely framed as coercion. It is described as market reaction. Responsibility is assigned to policy choices rather than structural constraints. Payment infrastructure further tightens control. Cross-border transactions rely on correspondent banking relationships that operate under strict compliance regimes. Banks deemed high risk face de-risking, losing access to clearing services. This effectively cuts them off from global finance, even without formal sanctions. The decision is decentralized, but the incentives are aligned. No institution wants exposure that could jeopardize dollar access. Trade finance operates under similar constraints. Letters of credit, insurance, and shipping guarantees depend on confidence in settlement. Once confidence erodes, trade grinds to a halt. Goods may exist, buyers may exist, sellers may exist. Without financing and insurance, exchange becomes impossible. Economic activity collapses without a single law being passed. Crisis response mechanisms complete the architecture. When liquidity dries up, countries turn to international lenders of last resort. Assistance arrives with conditions designed to restore market confidence. These conditions often prioritize creditor security over social stability. Spending cuts, tax increases, and structural reforms are implemented under pressure. The social cost is framed as necessary adjustment. The alternative is default and isolation. What distinguishes this system from historical forms of control is consent under constraint. Participation is voluntary only in theory. Opting out carries immediate and severe consequences. As a result, governments internalize the logic of the system. Policy debates narrow. Alternatives are dismissed as unrealistic. The range of acceptable action contracts. Even efforts to build parallel systems reveal the depth of dependence. New payment networks, regional currencies, and bilateral trade agreements emerge slowly and unevenly. They face issues of trust, liquidity, and scale. Without deep capital markets and crisis support, they cannot fully substitute the existing order. The cost of transition remains prohibitive. Markets understand this. Investors price political ambition as risk. Stability is rewarded. Innovation is tolerated only within boundaries. The invisible hand becomes a visible constraint. The financial weapon does not need to fire often. Its power lies in anticipation. The knowledge of vulnerability shapes behavior more effectively than punishment. Control is exercised through expectation rather than force. In this environment, sovereignty becomes conditional, autonomy becomes expensive, and resistance becomes a luxury few can afford. The architecture persists not because it is fair, but because it is functional. It delivers liquidity, order, and predictability at the price of dependence. The weapon is everywhere and nowhere. It does not march, it does not announce itself, it simply sets the terms under which the world is allowed to operate. The relationship between the United States of America and China is often framed as a rivalry between two powers competing for dominance. This framing is emotionally satisfying, politically useful, and analytically misleading. What exists instead is a tightly bound system of mutual exposure, where neither side can move decisively without inflicting damage on itself. It is not a Cold War. It is not a partnership. It is a financial standoff in which both actors are constrained by the same architecture. At the core of this standoff lies a profound asymmetry masked by apparent balance. The United States consumes. China produces. The United States issues the world's primary reserve currency. China accumulates that currency through trade. The United States runs persistent deficits. China runs persistent surpluses. Each side appears to hold a weapon against the other. In reality, each side holds a mirror. China's export-driven growth model depends on access to external demand at a scale that only the American market can provide. Decades of industrial expansion, employment stability, and internal social balance have been anchored to this flow. Reducing reliance on American consumption is a stated strategic goal, but structural transition is slow. Domestic demand cannot absorb the same volume without deep reforms, redistribution, and political risk. Until that transformation is complete, dependence remains. On the other side, the American economy depends on low-cost imports to sustain consumption without triggering inflation that would destabilize domestic politics. Supply chains optimized for efficiency and scale bind American retailers, manufacturers, and consumers to Chinese production. Attempts to reshore or diversify supply increase costs, strain margins, and provoke inflationary pressure. Economic decoupling sounds decisive. It behaves like self-sabotage. Finance locks this relationship in place. China holds vast reserves in dollar-denominated assets because it has no practical alternative. Those reserves are the byproduct of its own success. The United States relies on global demand for its debt to finance deficits without sacrificing growth. Each side's weakness is embedded in the other's strength. Trade wars expose the limits of confrontation. Tariffs are announced, rhetoric escalates, markets react. Then adaptation begins. Supply chains reroute partially, costs are shared, inflation shifts locations. The underlying flows persist. Neither side achieves decisive advantage. The spectacle satisfies domestic audiences. The structure remains intact. Technological competition follows a similar pattern. Restrictions on technology transfer, investment screening, and export controls slow diffusion but do not reverse interdependence. American firms depend on Chinese manufacturing ecosystems. Chinese firms depend on access to global markets and intellectual property. Fragmentation increases inefficiency without delivering autonomy. The system absorbs friction and continues. Currency conflict reveals the depth of constraint. Accusations of manipulation surface regularly. Yet radical moves are absent. A sharply weaker Chinese currency would provoke capital flight and financial instability. A sharply stronger currency would erode export competitiveness. Maintaining balance requires continued reserve accumulation and reinvestment in dollar assets. Policy flexibility is bounded by market reaction. The American side faces similar constraints. Aggressive pressure on China risks disrupting supply chains critical to price stability. Financial retaliation risks undermining confidence in the very debt market that finances American deficits. Escalation threatens the system that sustains American leverage. Restraint becomes rational. This mutual constraint produces a strange equilibrium. Each side prepares for confrontation rhetorically while avoiding actions that would trigger systemic rupture. Strategic documents emphasize competition. Balance sheets emphasize caution. The gap between narrative and behavior widens. Global markets understand this reality better than political discourse. Despite recurring crises, capital continues to flow between the two economies. Trade volumes fluctuate but do not collapse. Investment patterns adjust without breaking. The expectation of continuity stabilizes behavior. Panic is priced out. The relationship functions as a form of mutual hostage situation. Each side holds assets that would lose value if the other side were destabilized. Each side's prosperity is tied to the preservation of the system it publicly critiques. Neither side can exit without absorbing losses that outweigh perceived gains. This is why predictions of sudden decoupling repeatedly fail. Structural change occurs at the margin, not the core. Dependency is reduced slowly, cautiously, and asymmetrically. The process takes decades, not election cycles. The danger lies not in deliberate confrontation, but in miscalculation. The system is resilient, but not indestructible. Shocks that bypass rational control could force rapid adjustment. Until then, inertia dominates strategy. What appears as rivalry is in fact enforced coexistence. The financial architecture does not allow winners. It allows survival. Both sides know this. Both sides act accordingly. The standoff persists not because trust exists, but because collapse is mutually assured. The mutual hostage dynamic becomes even clearer when supply chains, capital flows, and strategic reserves are examined not as political symbols, but as balance sheet realities. Every major attempt to rebalance the relationship between the United States of America and China collides with the same constraint. Speed is the enemy of stability. Both systems are too large, too integrated, and too leveraged to absorb rapid separation. Consider global manufacturing. China's position is not defined merely by cheap labor, but by scale, density, and coordination. Entire industrial ecosystems exist within compressed geographic zones, supported by logistics, finance, energy, and labor markets optimized over decades. Replacing this capacity is not a matter of political will. It requires time, capital, and tolerance for inefficiency. When production shifts partially to other regions, costs rise. Those costs transmit directly into consumer prices, margins, and inflation. The adjustment burden falls disproportionately on importing economies. For the American system, this creates a political dilemma. Inflation is not an abstract metric. It is a daily experience. Rising prices erode purchasing power, confidence, and electoral stability. Every disruption to supply chains threatens this equilibrium. As a result, diversification proceeds cautiously. Strategic rhetoric accelerates. Operational change lags. The system resists shock. On the Chinese side, export dependence creates its own rigidity. Manufacturing employs tens of millions directly and indirectly. Social stability is tied to employment continuity. A sharp contraction in external demand would ripple through local governments, property markets, and household balance sheets. Financial buffers exist, but they are not infinite. Gradual adjustment is tolerable. Sudden loss is not. Capital markets mirror this caution. Despite political tensions, portfolio and direct investment flows adjust rather than collapse. Exposure is restructured, risk is repriced, complete withdrawal is avoided. Investors understand that decoupling destroys value faster than it creates safety. The dominant strategy is delay. Reserve management reinforces this inertia. China's dollar holdings are not passive. They are active stabilizers of its own currency and financial system. Reducing them aggressively would require accepting volatility that policymakers are unwilling to tolerate. Maintaining them preserves internal control at the cost of external dependence. The trade-off is explicit. The American debt market absorbs this behavior seamlessly. Foreign demand supports issuance. Domestic institutions provide depth. The central bank provides backstop capacity. The structure converts global caution into domestic financing. The more uncertain the world becomes, the more attractive the core appears. Fear strengthens the center. Technological fragmentation introduces new friction, but does not break the logic. Restrictions slow progress and increase duplication. Costs rise. Innovation diffuses unevenly. Neither side gains decisive advantage. Both incur inefficiency. The system absorbs the loss because the alternative is greater instability. Even geopolitical flashpoints follow this pattern. Tensions escalate, markets react briefly, then normalization resumes. Investors differentiate rhetoric from rupture. Pricing reflects probability, not possibility. The baseline assumption remains continuity. This equilibrium creates a dangerous complacency. Because the system has survived repeated shocks, confidence grows that it can survive any shock. Risk accumulates quietly. Leverage increases. Dependencies deepen. The margin for error narrows. The greatest vulnerability lies not in deliberate strategy, but in unintended consequence. A policy misstep, a financial accident, or an external shock could force adjustments faster than systems can adapt. The architecture is robust, but not elastic beyond certain limits. Until such a shock occurs, behavior remains constrained by mutual exposure. Both sides prepare narratives of independence while reinforcing dependence in practice. Decoupling remains a slogan. Integration remains a fact. The standoff persists because neither side can afford victory, if victory means collapse of the system that sustains them. Power is exercised through restraint. Strategy is defined by avoidance. The real conflict is not about dominance, but about managing dependency without triggering disaster. This is not balance born of cooperation. It is balance enforced by structure. And structure, once built at this scale, does not yield easily to intent. The final layer of the system reveals its true cost, and is not paid by governments negotiating behind closed doors or institutions issuing policy statements. It is paid by households, workers, small businesses, and future generations who never consented to the structure, but live inside its consequences. The global debt order does not extract value evenly. It concentrates benefit at the core and distributes adjustment at the periphery. The result is a slow, persistent transfer of purchasing power away from ordinary participants toward the architecture that sustains itself. At the center, the United States of America finances consumption through deficits that would be intolerable elsewhere. This is not a moral judgment, it is an operational reality. The ability to issue the world's primary reserve currency allows sustained borrowing without immediate constraint. But the inflationary pressure generated by this borrowing does not remain local. It travels outward through commodity pricing, shipping costs, and capital flows. Food, energy, and manufactured goods are repriced globally in dollars. When monetary expansion accelerates, prices rise everywhere, but wages do not adjust uniformly. The gap becomes a hidden tax. For countries outside the core, this tax manifests as currency pressure and higher living costs. When the dollar strengthens, imported inflation intensifies. Central banks respond by raising interest rates to defend stability. Credit tightens, investment slows, employment weakens. The adjustment burden falls on domestic economies that did not choose the policy that triggered it. Monetary sovereignty becomes conditional on external decisions. Households experience this as erosion rather than collapse. Rent increases faster than income. Energy costs spike unpredictably. Food prices drift upward. Savings lose real value. Debt becomes harder to service. None of these changes appear catastrophic in isolation. Together, they redefine normality. Living standards compress quietly. The middle class absorbs the shock first. It holds enough assets to lose value, but not enough power to hedge risk. Mortgages, consumer credit, and education loans are denominated in currencies sensitive to global rates. When conditions tighten, monthly obligations rise. Discretionary spending falls. Economic resilience thins. The illusion of stability persists until it does not. In developing economies, the effects are harsher. External debt denominated in dollars becomes more expensive as local currencies weaken. Governments allocate more revenue to servicing obligations and less to health, education, and infrastructure. Social investment is postponed. Growth potential erodes. The future is mortgaged to preserve the present. Corporate behavior reflects the same pressures. Firms optimize for currency exposure rather than productive investment. Financial engineering replaces expansion. Share buybacks compete with capital expenditure. Employment becomes flexible. Wages lag productivity. The system rewards balance sheet strength over long-term development. The labor market adapts downward. Job security declines. Benefits shrink. Informal work expands. Workers bear volatility that institutions avoid. The social contract weakens incrementally. Political dissatisfaction grows without clear attribution. The causes are systemic, but the experience is personal. Inflation plays a central role in this redistribution. It is often described as a domestic policy problem. In reality, it is a global transmission mechanism. Price stability in one region is maintained by instability elsewhere. The burden shifts along the supply chain until it settles where resistance is lowest. Usually, that is with consumers and workers. Debt compounds this effect across generations. Borrowing today defers costs to tomorrow. Infrastructure may be built, but so are obligations. Future taxpayers inherit liabilities without participating in the decision. Fiscal flexibility narrows over time. Options contract. Policy becomes reactive. The paradox is that this system appears successful by conventional metrics. Markets remain liquid, trade continues, crises are managed, catastrophe is avoided. Yet well-being declines beneath the surface. Growth persists without prosperity. Stability exists without security. World events repeatedly illustrate this pattern. During global shocks, capital retreats to the core. Peripheral economies face outflows. Currencies weaken. Financing dries up. Emergency measures follow. Recovery favors those already positioned to absorb volatility. Inequality widens across and within borders. This is not the result of conspiracy. It is the outcome of incentives aligned around liquidity and safety. The system rewards those who control settlement and penalizes those who depend on it. Participation is rational, exit is costly. The human cost accumulates slowly, making it difficult to mobilize response. No single moment marks the turning point. Instead, expectations adjust downward. What once felt temporary becomes permanent. What once felt unacceptable becomes routine. The global debt order is therefore not merely a financial structure, it is a social one. It shapes behavior, opportunity, and risk distribution. It decides who absorbs shocks and who deflects them. And it does so quietly, behind numbers that appear technical and neutral. This is the price of stability without reform. It is paid in diminished futures, constrained choices, and persistent insecurity. The bill does not arrive at once. It arrives every day in small increments to those least able to refuse it. The final consequence of this system is not collapse, but normalization. The world adapts to pressure by lowering expectations. What would once have triggered outrage becomes background noise. The extraordinary becomes routine. This is how structural extraction persists without revolt. For households, the adjustment becomes behavioral. Consumption patterns shift downward. Quality is substituted for affordability. Ownership gives way to subscription and credit. Financial planning shortens its horizon. Long-term security feels abstract compared to immediate survival. This is not cultural change. It is economic compression disguised as choice. For governments outside the core, policy space narrows year by year. Budget debates are framed around credibility rather than outcomes. Growth targets yield to debt sustainability. Social programs compete with interest payments. Investment is postponed to preserve market confidence. Political leaders inherit constraints they did not design and pass them forward as inevitabilities. Even within the United States of America, the benefits of the system are unevenly distributed. Asset holders gain from liquidity expansion. Wage earners lag behind price increases. Financial markets thrive while public infrastructure strains. Inequality widens quietly, buffered by credit and optimism. The center is not immune. It is merely insulated. This insulation relies on constant motion. Debt must grow to prevent contraction. Liquidity must expand to avoid crisis. Markets must remain confident to sustain demand. Stability becomes dynamic rather than static. Any pause risks exposure of underlying fragility. The system moves forward because stopping is more dangerous than continuing. Global coordination reinforces this inertia. International forums emphasize resilience, cooperation, and reform without challenging foundations. Adjustments are incremental. Language is cautious. No actor wishes to test the limits openly. The cost of being first is too high. Technological change introduces new variables, but not immediate escape. Digital currencies, alternative payment rails, and regional trade agreements promise diversification. In practice, they coexist with the dominant system rather than replacing it. Scale, trust, and crisis capacity remain concentrated. Innovation adds layers without removing the base. Younger generations inherit a world where volatility is assumed. Career paths are flexible because stability is rare. Debt is normalized as a condition of participation. Home ownership, long-term savings, and predictable advancement become aspirations rather than expectations. Economic anxiety becomes ambient. Political consequences follow. Frustration seeks outlets. Narratives simplify complex structures into villains and slogans. Polarization intensifies. Trust erodes. Yet the system itself remains largely untouched because alternatives lack clarity and coordination. Discontent circulates without resolution. The greatest risk lies in cumulative fatigue. Systems do not fail only from shock. They fail when participants lose belief in fairness and reciprocity. When effort no longer correlates with reward, compliance weakens. Informal economies expand. Capital seeks shelter. Institutions strain. Still, collapse is not imminent. The architecture is robust precisely because it externalizes cost and diffuses responsibility. Pain is distributed thinly across populations and time. No single group bears enough to force rupture. The system survives by avoiding concentration of resistance. This endurance creates a false sense of permanence. Because the structure has absorbed crises before, it is assumed it will absorb all future ones. Risk accumulates invisibly. Leverage rises. Dependencies deepen. Margins for error shrink. The global debt order thus persists not because it is optimal, but because it is the least disruptive option available. It delivers continuity at the expense of equity. Predictability at the expense of mobility. Control at the expense of consent. Those who benefit most defend it as stability. Those who bear the cost experience it as stagnation. Both are correct within their positions. The system does not lie. It simply prioritizes. The question is not whether this order can continue. It can, for a long time. The question is what kind of world it produces as it does. A world where crises are managed, but futures are constrained. Where growth exists without confidence. Where stability is purchased through quiet sacrifice. The bill is never presented as a single figure. It is paid gradually, invisibly, by those with the least capacity to refuse. And because it is paid slowly, it is rarely questioned, until the cost becomes impossible to ignore. That moment may still be far away, but every year of delay raises its price. This system will not collapse tomorrow. It does not need to. It survives by normalizing pressure, by spreading costs so thin that no one group can resist it, by convincing the world that there is no alternative. But every system that endures without consent accumulates tension, and every year that passes increases the price of stability. The question is not whether this order can continue. The question is how much it will take, and from whom, before it is forced to change. If you want to understand the world you live in, you cannot look only at numbers. You have to look at who absorbs the risk, who controls the rules, and who is left with no choice but to comply. Because the most dangerous systems are not the ones that collapse. They're the ones that work until they don't.